how about publish and maybe perish? It's all yours.
Thanks. Okay, we'll just move this
I'm
off.
going to move it up
Yeah,
here.
okay. Okay, can you all hear me out there? My name's David Mould, and the official title is Professor Emeritus. I was here for 30 years. It seemed like longer. Now I describe myself as an itinerant academic worker. You know, I move around from project to project. And one of the cool things is that people pay me to go to interesting places. And I write about them. So, you know, I make my money doing consulting, and along the way I take notes and I write articles, and indeed I write books. And tonight we're going to be talking about a region called Central Asia. That's where some of the shady regimes are. And it's based partly on my new book called Postcards from Stanland, Journeys in Central Asia, just out from the Ohio University Press. Anyway, the title, I mean, academics here will know that if you're an academe, you either publish or you perish. Professional suicide. So we're not talking about real death here, but we're saying that in some, that some journalists who publish can face professional suicide themselves, meaning they'd never work again. So we're not talking literally about people dying, but we're talking about the end to their professional careers. Okay, I think we should all start a presentation with a joke. So in Soviet times, the favorite subversive jokes were questions to Armenian radio, okay, which is like this wacky radio. And people, so this was a way that people introduced issues without putting them up front. So what's the difference between the constitutions of the US and USSR? Both guarantee freedom of speech. Well, but the Constitution of the USA guarantees freedom after you've spoken. Armenian radio joke's actually a lot of fun. There's another one about labor camps, Stalin's labor camps, and somebody says, what are the conditions in the labor camps? And the answer to that is, we hear they're very good. One of our listeners went there a few months ago. He has not returned. We hear he likes it there. So that was the subversive humor there. We know that journalists who cover wars and demonstrations and protests and natural disasters, they face danger every day. I'm going to focus on the more subtle, the more indirect dangers that journalists face. And let's maybe just have a quick Q&A on this. Let's say that you are a nasty tyrant in a country, okay? Try to imagine that for a moment, and you are unhappy with the press coverage you're getting. What are you going to do to those journalists? How are you going to keep them quiet without killing them? Okay, nobody loses their life. What powers would you have as a government or a business person to shut down media? Anybody? Throw them into prison. On what sort of charge? You make it up. You have some law about inciting social discord or disturbing the nation or whatever. Anything else you might do? Make regulations? All right, you make a series of regulations and laws which may not appear to censor the media, but make it very difficult for operate. For example, you can have a lot of business regulations which make it difficult for them to operate. Okay, we'll take one more and we'll find a few more along the road here. Yes? Yeah, just speak up a little bit. An act making it illegal to criticize the government. There we go. Okay. All right. Put all that together, and you've pretty much shut down the media. No freedom after the speech. Okay. So no wonder a lot of journalists put personal survival ahead of their principles and adopt what we would call self-censorship. They know which topics to cover, they can cover safely, and they know which ones are difficult or dangerous to cover. And that's the area we're going to be investigating tonight. Okay, we are going to... I've got stories about this because I've traveled fairly extensively in Asia and Africa. I'm going to concentrate tonight on one area, Central Asia, an area in which I've worked for about 20 years on and off. This is the area between the Caspian Sea and China, Russia, Siberia to the north, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, India to the south. An area not well known to many in the West. I think I'll argue here that the pressures or the controls that journalists face in Central Asia are very similar to those that they face in other countries. As I've traveled in Africa, as I've traveled in Southeast Asia, other regions of the world, I hear the same stories coming up. The names are different, but the same kind of pressures are absolutely there. So we're going to I'm going to just tell you 4 stories here. We're going to start in Bishkek, which is the capital of Kyrgyzstan, here, okay? Then we're going to go down to the south of the country, Osh. Then we are going to jump across to Astana, the new capital of Kazakhstan, and come back to its old capital, Almaty. A little tour of Central Asia with some harassment of journalist stories to accompany it. Okay, in this slide, I use the word Trump as a verb, okay? There's nothing else happening here, no subtle meanings, okay? So, I met a guy called Raisbek Omuzakov at the US Embassy in Bishkek, the capital of Kyrgyzstan. He was out on bail from prison. And he was a journalist for a weekly publication called Respublika. There are a couple of Respublikas in this story. And his crime was to tell it like it is. He had written about conditions at a factory hostel in Bishkek, where the workers lived in cramped, unheated rooms infested with vermin. And his report was based on interviews with the workers and first-hand observations. Good investigative journalism. Now, until recently, Kyrgyzstan was one of the few countries in the world where libel was a criminal rather than a civil offense. You could go to prison for libel. Fines and prison sentences up to 5 years. The factory manager, the manager of this slum of a factory hostel, filed a libel suit against Omuzakov, who was arrested, held in prison until the case went to trial. 2 factory workers testified his article was accurate. They were, in turn, charged with disseminating false information. And when the trial reopened, their testimony had mysteriously disappeared from the record, nowhere to be seen. Fearful of losing their jobs, no other workers, I think it was based on testimony from over 100 workers, no other workers came forward to back up the story. But the trial did not focus on the actual conditions at the hostel. In fact, the factory manager agreed, yes, conditions are bad in the hostel. They focused on the factory manager's honor and dignity. Even if he was responsible for housing workers in bad conditions, his public reputation had been reduced. And Omuzakov, the journalist, had crossed the line by criticizing him. The case shows that in the libel cases, provable truth, which would be the standard in the US and in many other countries, was no defense. You could show that the conditions were as bad as the article had outlined, but in this particular case, because the reputation of the factory manager had been impugned, had been attacked, it was libel. So there was a pretty strong international reaction to this. This is while I was living in Kyrgyzstan. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Committee to Protect Journalists all came forward and said, you know, you shouldn't be locking up people for articles like this. You know, if there's an issue, bring a civil libel case, but don't put people in prison. And Omazakov was not the only one who was put into prison at this time. And the government was surprised by the international reaction. So the president's press secretary called me and he said, can you come over to the White House, it was still the White House there as well, and explain to me what's going on. He said, you know, this is a domestic issue. You know, people in New York should not be writing to us and telling us what to do. We are a sovereign country. We can do what we want. And, you know, I told him that, you know, as long as the country of Kyrgyzstan kept throwing journalists in prison for publishing stories that could be documented, they were going to keep hearing from Amnesty International and other pressure groups as well. And I said, you know, there's no way you're going to stop this. Emails, websites, listservs, you know, today's social media. I said, maybe the president and the parliament should actually think about changing the law on this. Omazakov was released after about 3 months in jail, later sentenced to 3 years in prison. The sentence was later suspended. The president at that time, President Askar Akayev, said he supported decriminalizing libel, but the parliamentary deputies who had to pass the law disagreed. And in fact, they introduced even more strict restrictions, a new media bill which clamped down on anything from pornography to reporting on people under criminal indictment. We may wonder why the parliamentary deputies did this. At this time, 117 parliamentary deputies were under criminal indictment. Okay, so they obviously had a little bit of self-interest in preventing reporting on this. In 2005, in the so-called Tulip Revolution, the president, Akayev, was overthrown, and the new regime that came in with a high called Kurmanbek Bakiev was, if anything, even more repressive. 4 years later, in 2009, Omazakov, the journalist I've been talking about, he was attacked on the street and beaten up by thugs. The police did a cursory investigation. Nobody was ever arrested for that crime. And the debate over libel dragged on and on. You know, every couple of years there'd be a big conference and the Western aid agencies would come in and there would be a draft bill in the parliament and all of that. And then something else would come up and it would drop off the political agenda. So it was not until April 2011, 14 years after Omazakov had gone to prison, that a bill came into the parliament to make libel a civil rather than a criminal offence. And of course the Western government said this is great, at first Kyrgyzstan is on its way to democracy, this is all wonderful. But remember, what politicians give, they can always also take away. So just 2 years ago, the parliament reversed itself. It passed a law calling itself the False Accusation Law, ostensibly to prevent publication of libelous reports about people under criminal investigation, which still included some of the people in the parliament, of course. And the law makes intentional defamation a criminal offence, punishable by up to 3 years in prison. We are exactly back where we started in, with the Omazakov case, with libel remaining a criminal offence in Kyrgyzstan, and the courts, which are widely regarded as corrupt, supporting the business and political elite. Okay, so I can stop for questions now before I move on to the next one, or I can keep going. So you're going to just tell you 4 stories here. Right, yeah.
Question, how did the reporting in the newspaper change over that period of time? Did the
Well, I mean, I think what happens here is that journalists look at Omazakov and other journalists who got locked up and went, if I do this, this is going to happen to me. I'm going to get locked up, or my family will be threatened. I'm going to come out of the office late at night, and there are going to be some guys in leather jackets on the corner who are going to beat me up, or they're going to, bring other pressures against me. So, the way that Omazakov and indeed the analysts interpreted this is, a warning was being sent to all journalists: don't do this. Play it safe. Okay? So it's not as if everything became state propaganda. There's always a certain level of criticism. Some people will always push the boundaries. But in this particular case, this is what can happen to you. All right? Okay? A message to everybody. All right. So we're now going to move to the south of Kyrgyzstan, to a city called Osh, which is the second largest city in the country. This is a region where in the 1920s the Soviet Union kind of gerrymandered the borders. You may sort of look at the borders, they look kind of crazy there. Well, this was to keep ethnic groups down and to keep Islam down. They just drew the borders in a strange way so that the ethnic groups were divided up. So, although Osh is in Kyrgyzstan, it's just a couple of miles from the border with Uzbekistan. About half the population is ethnic Uzbek there. They are dominant in trade and in commerce and business. So when the Soviet Union started to break up in 1990, conflicts broke out between Kyrgyz and Uzbeks over land, over political control. In 1990, up to 1,000 people were killed in conflict between the two groups, and a lot of property destroyed as well. I went to Osh a few years later to set up a media training center for journalists where Kyrgyz, Uzbek, and Russian journalists could all work together. And one of the people I met on this trip is a guy called Khalil Hudabiev. Hudiberdiev. I've got to get my Russian back here. Okay, Hudiberdiev. He was the Uzbek owner of Osh Television, Osh TV, which was the first commercial TV station to be established in the country. And because it was broadcasting in a multi-ethnic area, Kyrgyz, Uzbeks, Russians, Tajiks, all sorts of people, it broadcast in 3 languages. However, the local government, which was controlled by the Kyrgyz, accused it regularly of being pro-Uzbek in its sympathies. Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, there's no love lost between the regimes there. President of Uzbekistan died pretty recently, but the countries have always been at loggerheads over various issues. So the local government was trying to shut down this predominantly, this TV station, very popular because of its supposed pro-Uzbek leanings. Now, most of the programming on there was entertainment programming, for goodness sake, and it happened to be owned by an Uzbek. So how did they go about this? Okay, this comes back to this first question I was asking. Well, there were raids by the security service and the tax police. Oh, we need to check your books here. We need to make sure you've paid all of your taxes, okay? And then we're going to come back in another few months and check them again, that kind of harassment. Then building inspectors and fire marshals. Oh, your building is not up to code. Okay, you're going to have to close down now, So official harassment, seems a little petty here, but you're trying to run a television station, you're trying to run a business, and that will shut you down. And then there were the mysterious power cuts. Suddenly, just before the news comes on, the power goes out, just in that little block in the city, or the power goes out to the transmitter. We're really sorry, we can't explain why that happened, So, all of that kind of stuff goes on. The station was broadcasting, I know we're in the digital age now, but at that time on VHF, which was the preferred broadcast frequency. It was forced to switch to UHF, which is much more difficult to tune, not everybody can get it, because supposedly it was interfering with emergency broadcasts. Yet other stations were allowed to continue broadcasting on VHF. So a whole series of harassments going on there. Through all of this, it remained the most popular TV station in the South, attracting viewers from all ethnic groups. And Hudiberdiev was a pretty smart guy. I mean, he paid off all the local politicians of whatever party, you know? That's what he had to do to stay in business. And he even made friends with the police. He kind of ran this sort of cops reality show, you know, once a month, which showed the police on their raids and how great they were, you know. So he was kind of playing a smart game. Anyway, everything fell apart in 2010 when Kyrgyzstan has its second revolution in 5 years. This time it was the successor to Akayev Bakiev, who was widely regarded as pretty corrupt and authoritarian. So the revolution starts in the north of the country, in Bishkek. Bakiev's power base is in the south. And his people start fomenting trouble between the Kyrgyz and the Uzbeks to prove that the country's ungovernable because he's been overthrown. You need Bakiev there to shore up the south to keep the country together. So clashes resulted in almost 500 dead, a lot of property damage, about 400,000 people displaced, over 100,000 flee across the border to Uzbekistan. And again, the Kyrgyz authorities blame the Uzbeks. Okay, the Uzbeks are the bad guys in this. So there's a whole nationalist push here. Uzbek schools are pressured to start teaching the Kyrgyz language. Uzbek language signs replaced with Kyrgyz language signs. And Uzbek media are closed or forced to sell out. So here's what happens at Osh TV. The security police raid the station again. They seize the computers and the video archives. They arrest Hudiberdiev and take him back to the police station. He's released later in the day, but the police do this kind of interrogation. How many members do you have in your family? Okay, and where are they? And how old are your children? You know, thinly veiled threats to the family. Then the mayor of Osh, the Kyrgyz mayor of Osh, insists that he sell 51% of the company to the mayor in return for security for his family. Okay, you want your family to be safe, you're basically going to give up your TV station. At that time, an independent valuation put the station's value at about $1.5 million. The mayor of Osh said, we're in a difficult political situation now. I'm going to value it at $400,000. And as Hudiberdiev reported later, he said he was in the mayor's office. There were men in there with automatic rifles, and I had no choice but to agree. You know, this is not the sort of real estate deal that should go down normally. He claims he was paid only $20,000 and fled the country with his family. A few months later, he was sentenced by a court in absentia to 20 years in prison on charges of participating in mass killings and using his station to stir up violence. Absolutely no basis for that at all, politically motivated. So today, Osh TV broadcasts only in the Kyrgyz language, neglecting all of the Uzbek speakers in the region. And when the mayor of Osh was asked a couple of years later if he owned Osh TV, he had an interesting response. He said, I don't remember who owns what. This is the murky world of media and politics there. So, inevitably, all of these pressures lead to what we would call self-censorship. Journalists either don't cover topics that can get them into trouble, or they cover them in such a way that they don't, you know, that they don't cross the line. As I travel around, I've got a standard question I ask journalists. This is it. Which topic, not specifically prohibited by law, and there will be some that are prohibited by law, do you not cover or cover only with extreme caution? It's, you get some very, very interesting responses to this question. So, I mean, I've asked it in Indonesia, I've asked it in Russia, I've asked it in Thailand, I've asked it in a number of countries. I'm going to give you the Kazakhstan answers to that one, okay? And, this is based not on one interview, but on quite a few interviews and more casual conversations. So, here's a list of 5 taboo or touchy topics, okay? And as you see, apart from the last one, they all relate to either the public or the private affairs of the president or government officials. Okay? And we'll be coming back to this slide a little bit later. But when I was working in this region in the late 1990s, another topic got added to the list. There was a number 6. This is pretty much the list since independence, and it's pretty much the list today. This has not changed really at all. So for a few years, this became the new topic number 6. Problems in the new capital, Astana, which, as you see, is in the north of the country there, the north central part. So in 1994, the government, or rather the president, Nazarbayev, announced that the country would be moving the capital from Almaty, which is in a lovely location down in the southeast of the country, tucked into a fold of the Tian Shan Mountains. Nice cosmopolitan place. They're going to be moving from there to a place called Akmola at the time, which is in the middle of the steppe, flat land, pasture country in the north central part of the country. So the immediate question from almost everybody, including most Kazakhs, was, where? Where are we going? Nobody had heard of the place. Which was usually followed by the next question, how cold does it get there? I lived there for 6 months. It gets very cold. First day I was there, minus 30 Celsius. Ooh, it could get down to minus 50. So opposition politicians questioned the price tag. I mean, there were political reasons for moving your capital closer to the center of the country, but this was a time of economic crisis. The country faced a huge budget deficit and major economic and social problems, and the cost was estimated at something between $500 million and $1 billion. Now that's a pretty big range, which indicates that either the cost was a state secret, okay, or more likely nobody had the faintest idea what it was going to cost. So in the Kazakh language, depending on how you pronounce it, Akmola can mean white way or white death. And so the White Death was a sort of a convenient way for people in Almaty sipping their cocktails to complain about where they were being sent. They're being sent to their death on the steppe in the north. And there was a funny article in The Economist, which sort of played on this, called Akmola, a play on the word Akmola. However, Nazarbayev did not change his mind, and the government quickly settled the issue about the spelling by changing the name from Akmola to Astana, which in the Kazakh language means capital. So Kazakhstan's kind of interesting. It has the international distinction, being the only country in the world where the capital is called, in the native language, capital. A little side there. And it's a pretty bizarre looking place, okay? This very, very futuristic architecture. Western journalists were critical. They talked about either the Potemkin village or, should we say, the blazing saddles, nature of the place, or, all facades and nothing behind. But local journalists were discouraged from reporting about all of the problems there. There were gas, electricity problems, water shortages, and residents of Akmola were being evicted from their apartments to make way for government officials. So it was a pretty ruthless move. But criticism was viewed as, if not exactly treasonous, at least unpatriotic. And I've been told by more than one person that in the winter before the move, Astana's daytime temperatures were actually warmer than usual, which means minus 25 rather than minus 30 degrees. That's not because it was actually warmer, but the weather forecasts on government-controlled TV inflated the temperatures there so that people didn't think it was going to be so dang cold. I lived there for 6 months. It is very, very cold. Okay, I'm going to finish with one other story here, and then we can have a discussion and take questions. This is the part that Rox did not want in my promo for this. Okay, but I can talk about it now. Okay, so meet Irina Petrusheva. She's somebody who's got investigative journalism in her blood. In the 1980s, her father, who was a correspondent for Pravda, a leading Soviet newspaper, we sort of think of the Soviet media as kind of monolithic and uncritical, but in fact there was criticism in the Soviet times of corruption within the Communist Party. And what her father did, Petrushev, he exposed corruption in the government of the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic, the predecessor to Kazakhstan. So in 2000, Petrusheva founded a newspaper called the same one as that earlier one in Kyrgyzstan, Respublika, like the business of the people, the business of the public, as a business newspaper. But it soon had a circulation of about 18,000 for a weekly and strong advertising revenue. And it started investigating scandals in the government, including misappropriation of funds for the airport. Kazakhstan is rich in oil in the Caspian Sea. This is its major source of income, and a lot of those drilling concessions were going to groups close to the government and the president's family. And where did they send all this money when they got it? They didn't keep it in Kazakhstan. Switzerland seemed a nice place for it, okay? So it went out there. And then, of all arrogant things, a whole plane load of tourists being told to get off so the president's daughter could fly alone without any other distractions, okay? So what Respublika's doing here, what Petrusheva's doing, is she is violating, at least the first four of these, okay? She's on very, very dangerous ground here. She is breaking the taboos. She's breaking the, sort of the general agreement among journalists about what you don't talk about. So, what happens, okay? Here is, this is not a complete list, but it's, a partial list. Firstly, Respublika cannot get anybody to print the newspaper. Everybody's scared. So printers come, printers go, and the last printer quits after he finds a human skull on the doorstep, okay? So what Respublika does, it has to resort to self-publishing. They buy a digital printer and they, the staff assembles a newspaper. So it takes like 3 days to put it together. It would take an hour at the printing plant, but they're putting it together themselves, collating and stapling. Also, criminal charges filed against Petrusheva, charging her with violating labor laws. This is an example I think somebody mentioned earlier. You know, you don't go at them with a media law. You say, oh, well, you know, you're not treating your workers right, and there's this irregularity or that irregularity. International Women's Day. Congratulations, Miss Petrusheva. Here's a funeral wreath for you. Yep, scary stuff. Court suspends the newspaper for 3 months. Then it gets really nasty. Okay, there's a headless body of a dog tied to the door of the offices with a threatening note. And then the next day, the head of the dog appears outside Petrusheva's apartment. And a couple of days later, the office is firebombed, burned to the ground. Okay. Journalism, great career. yeah. You know, to their credit, I mean, the staff keep going. They move to new offices, and the harassment continues. In 2012, a media monitoring group in Kazakhstan recorded 19 assaults on journalists, 17 criminal cases, including 11 of criminal libel, more than 100 civil libel suits, and more than 180 cases where access to websites, online forums, and blogs were denied. Petrusheva, who had already fled the country, was handed a suspended jail sentence, and she moved to Moscow. She's in London now, but she's still working long distance. Thank goodness for the internet. Here's what she said after this happened in 2002, speaking in New York when she was given the 2002 International Press Freedom Award. You can read it for yourself. She's concerned not only for her children, she's concerned for her family, she's concerned for her country and its freedoms. Braver than most, I have to say. So Respublika's still printing, though today primarily it is an online publication and you know, has a very, very active Facebook page. And you know, it plays a kind of a cat and mouse game with the authorities using proxy servers and other devices to expose the continuing corruption in the government. In August 2014, there was a leak of a large volume of emails from members of Kazakhstan's ruling elite, which were published on the internet. Respublika used some of them in articles and its Facebook page. And the government claimed that its computers had been hacked, although it's quite possible that a disenchanted member of the government had leaked them. So this is quite interesting. There's been a case that's been going on for a few months in the US courts here. So November last year, the government of Kazakhstan, citing the US Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, subpoenaed Facebook for the names, email addresses, IP addresses, and MAC addresses of users associated with Respublika's Facebook account. Whew! And there were several court hearings and some technical things there. But basically, in March this year, a federal judge in California quashed the subpoena, saying that the search was overly broad, that it was going to bring in a lot of people who had nothing to do with Kazakhstan at all, dangerously close to a fishing expedition. It said there was no evidence or claim Respublika was involved in the hacking, and the case had First Amendment implications. But again, it's another indication of what somebody described to me as the many gears of government, the many ways that government and the business elites that are associated with them can go after journalists. And as I said earlier, this is Central Asia. My book, Postcards from Sandland. But you know, I've heard similar stories when I've talked to journalists in many other countries. So let me thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take questions. By the way, if you want a postcard from Stanland, they're free. Okay, I've got a book called Postcards from Stanland. You might as well have a postcard as a calling card. So you want to pick up one of those, put it on your fridge. Free. Yeah.
In your experiences when you were traveling and interviewing, did you feel like you had undue scrutiny on you, or did you feel threatened?
Oh, did I feel scrutiny? Yeah. I didn't feel threatened because I'm a foreigner, okay? And, you know, they're going to think twice about going after somebody. I mean, I was on a Fulbright fellowship some of the time. I was working for USAID some of the time. You know, they're going to think twice about that. I do remember in Russia when I was working there, I was actually teaching a class at a university for a few days, and there was this guy who showed up the class who was like twice the age of all of the other students, you know? And he asked really stupid questions, and my interpreter said, yeah, he's from the security services. He's been nominated to sort of keep an eye on you. So, no, I'm sure I was watched, you know. Sometimes I pick up the telephone at the apartment, you hear some mysterious clicking sounds. I never felt pressured myself, but then again, anything that I was going to be writing or publishing wasn't going to be distributed domestically, and that's what they were concerned about. However, your question is a good one, because my meeting somebody could actually put them in danger, and there have been a few occasions where I've thought about this as somebody I really, really, really want to talk to, but then I think about their situation and I think, you know, is my meeting them so I can do my research on my article going to put them in danger as well? And I think that's a question you all have to ask. Yeah. Yeah.
So, I can't remember the names, unfortunately, but
Oh, I meant to repeat the questions, by the way. Okay, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
the television station that you were talking about, once it was switched over to a monolingual format, have there been any other television stations that have come up to try and take the load or be what the first one was before it was taken by the government?
Okay, so the question was referring to Osh TV, whether after it was taken over and switched only to Kyrgyz language, whether there were other TV stations that, as he said, stepped up and filled in. Osh TV was actually one of two Uzbek language TV stations that were shut down at the time. The answer is actually no, okay? Now, I mean, there is a little bit of sort of nominal Uzbek language programming on some stations there. But the news is definitely in Kyrgyz, things are controlled. And again, nobody's going to try and do, well, I mean, Osh TV really didn't do anything wrong. I mean, it was actually not doing much in the way of critical reporting. This was a kind of an ethnically inspired campaign against it. But again, you know, a TV station owner is going to be rather careful about their programming, all right? What they're going to do is they're going to go and they're going to sit down with the local administration and say, we're planning this and we're planning that. What do you think? You know, which is, of course, completely surrenders any editorial independence that you have. So again, you know, they're in this really, really, you know, tough situation. Things in Kyrgyzstan are kind of fluid in some ways, so I won't say that won't happen. Latest I've seen, things are still pretty shut down in the south there. In the north, in Bishkek, it's a little bit more open, but in the south, I think the Uzbek voices. Of course, you can pick up Uzbek television from Uzbekistan, so it's not like they're completely deprived, but not within Kyrgyzstan itself. Yes? Are these governments elected in any halfway legitimate way? These are all great democracies. Yeah, I mean, all of these countries hold elections, okay? And they are Well, I mean, depends. I mean, there's always some corruption in elections. I mean, in a country like Kyrgyzstan, where, the ethnic differences have been so dramatically underlined, in ethnic riots, people tend to vote for their ethnic group. Okay? There's a lot of voting on ethnic lines or on regional lines. So, for example, the southern Kyrgyz don't like the northern Kyrgyz. Historically, these regions, they were never countries. I mean, historically, we've got nomadic populations that lived in large extended families and then clans and then tribes. And so, if you talk to a Kyrgyz or you talk to a Kazakh, if they're talking to each other, if they haven't met, the first question is, what is your rule, what is your tribe, and what is your jus, which would be the larger conglomeration. So there's a lot of clan and ethnic-based politics. So by Western standards, some elections are freer than others. What I would say here is that the government has, in the United States, would say they have a great get-out-the-vote machine, okay? Which means that every public official, which would include every teacher at the university where I taught, has a responsibility to take employees or students to the polls, okay? And we kind of know how they're going to vote, okay? So the ruling government, especially in a country like Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan, has a really built-in advantage of incumbency and ability to mobilize all the organs of public administration and all of the media. So, at that point, it really doesn't matter whether you stuff ballot boxes or not. You've kind of got that, that built-in advantage there. Any hope that some? Yeah, okay. Is there any hope that this would be cleaned up, the electorate would get sick and tired? I think, I don't want to go to Maslow's hierarchy of needs here, but maybe I will. For a lot of people there, politics don't change. I mean, they're more concerned with, do they have enough food? Do they have a roof over their heads? And what those damn politicians do, we know they're all crooks anyway, really doesn't matter too much. So I think if the economic situation, I think what we see in many countries is when the economic situation improves, then people move to another level and they start then being concerned about, public policy and who's in charge there. When people are struggling to survive, not by that. So, yeah, it's a mixed picture. I mean, Uzbekistan's going to be very, very interesting over the next couple of years because the long-time dictator Islam Karimov, dictator, died earlier this month, and so there will be a power struggle here, and what emerges out of that will be quite interesting. Probably, there'll be other people who are in the same kind of police state mode that will come up, but at least there's a bit of a power vacuum there. The big question in Kazakhstan is what happens when Nazarbayev dies as well. So, yeah, all of these countries are somewhat unstable and they could see political change. The rulers were all very worried by the Arab Spring, okay? So, and their reaction was, shut down WordPress, shut down Facebook, shut down social media, shut down the cell phone network, So yeah, that they have a sort of a knee-jerk reaction to that. Yeah. Yes.
From your experience, do you see any similarities in the Western press about self-censorship, more subtle possibly than?
The question: do I see any similarities in the Western press in terms of self-censorship? I think I was as a journalist. I think every journalist self-censors to some degree, right? I think it happens, if you're not going to especially at the local level. You know, you're not going to keep writing critical articles or doing critical broadcasts on the mayor of your city, you know? You've got to keep up your contacts, you know? If every crime story you do criticizes the police, then somehow you're not going to get your contacts at the police station. So every journalist walks a bit of a line, but I mean, it's just much more severe here. And I mean, I think everybody, has to make a judgment as to whether it's worth pushing on this particular issue or whether that's going to close up my contacts, which I need to continue working for the long term. Yeah.
Did they have like journalist associations and are probably press council, and what did they do with those issues?
Is there a journalist association and
Like press council?
press councils? Okay. Oh yeah. Right. That's a pretty interesting question. I did some research on journalist associations because the U.S. government and USAID had exactly the same question. Are there journalist associations and are they doing anything? What you find here is in the Soviet Union, there was a union of journalists, but it was like a government, Communist Party-controlled union. And, periodically, associations are set up which are meant to defend journalists. Some of them then get co-opted by the government, because often they're dependent on donor money. The US or somebody comes in and gives them some money to start going for a couple of years, and the money runs out. So it's a pretty difficult situation. I mean, I think partly it's tied to the whole economic situation of the media. If the media were financially stronger, they would be in a better position to argue that. There's a lot of hidden ownership as well. I mean, what appears to be an quote-unquote independent commercial company, scratch the surface there. Oh, I see that the major shareholders, it's the president's daughter. Okay, it's this person connected with the prime minister. So I think, I mean, this is not something I covered here, but I mean, ownership patterns are incredibly important. Who gets the major network TV licenses? How are they awarded? Was the 10 of that? So there are journalist associations, and they make a little bit of noise now and again. But journalists are also very argumentative people. I mean, and so a lot of these associations are sort of dominated by a couple of people who then argue with other people, and then after a couple of years, things fall apart. So there are not terribly effective, I would have to say. Yes?
Kind of going off the question about Western journalism,
Yeah.
when you ask the question about what journalists are hesitant to cover, do you think that there are issues here that journalists are hesitant to cover?
Okay. I'm not sure I can address that one. Are there issues here in the United States that journalists are afraid to cover? What do you think?
I think yes. I think that surveillance and like what happened with Edward Snowden and Glenn Greenwald discourages a lot of journalists.
Uh-huh.
I think that
Okay, maybe I should almost have the microphone on you here. Okay, all right, okay. What happened with surveillance and what happened with Edward Snowden? Yeah?
like gag laws with the agriculture industry, I think that discourages journalists from covering those issues. And I just think like I think maybe here there's not as many repercussions, but there's still like it's difficult to get information about things.
Right, okay, yeah. So, it's an issue of access to information. I mean, corporate information would be a good example. I mean, there's a lot of things that you can't get out of corporations, huh? And there are gag orders and things like that. Yeah, I think it's a bit more complicated here, and I would agree with you that the repercussions for, breaking the taboos, are not as serious. But I think there have been several examples in the U.S. of journalists who really gone up against the system, and then, somehow their career has not progressed the way that they hoped it would. It has not had quite the same trajectory when, some who went up against the Bushes, for example. We need to wrap, right?
Yeah, we need to wrap. So at this point, I just wanted to thank Dr. David Mould, and I wanted to encourage you guys to come up if you do have questions, okay?
Sure.
So, yay! Thank you.
Okay, thank you.